Greetings, everyone. This is Dr. Ray Lindley. I'm the executive director of Array Global, and welcome to this workshop. We've been looking forward to this workshop today. For the topic is one that I think everyone will enjoy and all of us can use. We never reach the point where we don't need more suggestions and more help on how we uh, take care of our teaching responsibilities. So welcome everyone. We know that several will be coming on yet, so we welcome those of you who are here. It's great to see some familiar faces, and it's great to see some new faces. So welcome everyone. I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Jacob Frankham, and Dr. Jake will give some announcements, and then we'll go on with our program for today.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. It's great to be with you on this third Saturday and excited for this workshop, especially about classroom management, which we all can improve on as educators. I know specifically that's been my experience as I've taught. A few different announcements. We have an academic contest right now that's taking place. It's called 3D by Me, and there's about 12 more days to have your students to submit their entries. So I encourage you to get into our website and have your students create something that's 3D, take a picture and upload it. We have cash prizes, we provide certificates, and love to have your students part of that. In years past, we've had hundreds. I think last time, Dr. Ray, we had we had over 1,000 entries. We had like 1,200 entries. It was awesome. Another great activity that we have going on until May is called Me and My Community. Your students can get a certificate recognition for doing service, community service, just at their school or around in their neighborhoods or anything like that. So please, again, get onto our website, learn more about that. Our next workshop is February 15th, which please make sure you put that on your calendar. It's interesting because neither Dr. Ray and I will be at home. We'll be traveling. I will be in Dubai and he will be off vacationing. So we're hoping that he could participate in that. One thing where the reason why I'm going to be in Dubai is my next announcement. It's the Common Core Boot Camp, and we encourage you to register for that if you're in the region and you want to be part of an amazing program. They always fill up completely. They usually can only hold 600 or 700 people at the University of Dubai, and we're going to be a sponsor. We'll be a featured speaker. We'll have a booth there. And we just love to have you as part of that boot camp. And I'll put the link here in the chat here in a few minutes. And one last thing is, as with all the workshops, at the very end, after Dr. Ray does his words of wisdom, we will put the Google form link in the chat so you can fill that out and get a certificate. And you'll have the certificate in your email Wednesday morning. So with that, those are all the announcements that I have. I want to introduce Dr. Mike, who's our associate director. And Dr. Mike has a tremendous amount of experience, probably second only to Dr. Ray, just because Dr. Ray's been around a little bit longer. But
He's
Dr.
older
Mike,
and I'm next.
yeah, that's right. Dr. Mike's been a school administrator. He's worked as a professor for many, many years. But I think what's most impressive, he's been a mentor for many, many educators. Many people turn to him and ask him about education. And he's visited many of the schools that we work with also. So with that, I'd like to turn the time over to Dr. Mike, who's going to introduce our presenter today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jacob. It's my privilege to introduce Ryan Cantrell. I've gotten to know Ryan as a student, a colleague, and I'm glad to call him friend. Ryan has been a teacher, a special education teacher, a principal, a director of special education, and a superintendent. So he has covered the gamut in terms of educational roles. And recently, he was the chief deputy state superintendent for Idaho. And so he has not only the school experience, but he also has the state level policymaking experience and those kinds of things. So welcome, Ryan, and we're looking forward to your presentation today.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Happy to be here. Give me just a moment to share my screen and we'll get started together. So as Mike stated, I've done a lot in public education in the last 20 years or so. I started as a behavior therapist, working with some really intense, really tough kids, trying to help them change their behavior to use more appropriate behavior in the classroom. And then I transitioned into special education, where I taught special education as a public educator for 7 or 8 years, and then moved into the role of a principal and also served as a special education director during that time, and then ultimately served as a superintendent. And so I did that for about 5 years. After that, I served as the chief deputy superintendent for the state of Idaho. And most recently, I've moved into a position where I serve as a change manager for adult learning. And so I've been using these models and these ideas for how to manage behavior, whether it's classroom behavior or it's individual behavior. I've been doing this for about 20 years. And so I'm happy to take questions at the end if you have some specific questions that you have about your classroom or how you might manage your classroom. My education background started in social work. I actually got a BA in social work and then transitioned into teaching and got a master's in special education, and then went back and got what we call in Idaho an ed specialist, which is like a second master's in building administration, and then ultimately in superintendency. And so I've spent a lot of time over the last 2 decades thinking about this topic, and I'm very passionate about it. And the reason I'm passionate about it is because I've seen it make a very positive difference for people, both teachers and the students and the families in education. So what are we going to do together today? Here are the learning objectives. I want to talk with you about the principles of what we call ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis. And one of the main components to applied behavior analysis is this concept of ABC. Real easy to remember, ABC. Antecedent, behavior, consequence. If you get nothing more out of today, those are the 3 things I want you to remember: antecedent, behavior, consequence, because we're going to spend some time talking about those 3 things together. And the third learning objective is I want you to walk away with an idea of how you can manage your classroom and how you can support your students, especially those 1 or 2 students that you have that can be really hard to support and really hard to help them learn well in the classroom. And the fourth one, which I didn't list, but it kind of engulfs the other 3, is I want to change your mindset today. I want to get you thinking differently about managing behavior. That's probably my #1 goal, is to change the way you think about classroom behavior and change the way you think about managing your classroom. So we're going to start off with a story. I'm going to take a minute and I'm just going to read it to you. So you can sit back for a moment, but I want to read this to you, and then I'm going to ask you to think about it. It starts down there at the blue arrow, so I'm going to read it to you. To give you an idea of what's at stake, consider the following analogy. An infant is learning how to crawl. She begins by pushing herself backwards across the house. Backing herself around, she gets lodged beneath the furniture. There she thrashes about, crying and banging her little head against the sides of the undersides of the pieces. She's stuck and she hates it. So she does the only thing she can think of to get herself out. She pushes even harder, which only worsens the problem. She's now more stuck than ever. If this infant can talk, she would blame the furniture for her troubles. After all, she's doing everything she can think of. The problem couldn't possibly be hers. But of course, the problem is hers, even though she can't see it. While it's true that she is doing everything she can think of, the problem is precisely that she can't see how she is the problem. Having the problem that she has, nothing she can think of will be the solution. Deception is like this. It blinds us to the true causes of the problems. And once we're blind, all of the solutions we can think of will actually make matters worse. Whether at work or at home, deception obscures the truth about ourselves, corrupts our views of others and our circumstances, and inhibits our abilities to make wise and helpful decisions. To the extent that we're deceived, both our happiness and our leadership are undermined at every turn, and not because of the furniture. That is one of my very favorite stories as it applies to classroom management, and it's from a group called the Arbinger Institute. If there were one book that I were going to recommend every leader read, it's the book Leadership and Self-Deception. And we can put that in the chat if you want to look it up. Leadership and Self-Deception by the Arbinger Institute. And the reason I believe it is such a powerful book is it illustrates that we as the teacher, we as the educator, are the number one influence in our classroom. We sometimes tend to blame the student, blame the parents, blame the system, blame the administrator, blame, blame, blame. But the reality is, we as the educator are the number one influence in our classroom. How we think about things, how we behave, and the mindsets that we use is the number one influence on the success that our students have. And so that's the first thing that I wanted to talk with you about today, is when you think about classroom management and you think about changing student behavior, I would ask and challenge that you believe and take on the responsibility that you are the number one influence in that situation. Why does that matter? Because so often we look at behavior, and when we think about behavior, if we want a different result, we try to change only the behavior, whether it's in ourselves or our students or other areas in life. But if we don't change the way we think about things or the mindset that drives that behavior, we are unlikely to get different results. The best behavior change comes from thinking about it differently. And that's what I'm going to ask you to do today, is to change your mindset. So why does this matter? Well, with Arbinger principles, they're going to ask us to shift our focus to ourselves, to me. As the educator, I've got to ask myself, what can I do differently to improve success for my students? The reason we start with that principle of I'm the number one influence is it really will foster and create a better relationship between the teacher and the students. Why does it do that? Because if I accept the responsibility that I can help change a student's behavior, I'm far less likely to blame that student or blame that family for the behavior that the student is using. If I'm part of the solution, then I'm more likely to want to help the student change that behavior rather than blaming them. So let's talk for a moment about ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis. Big words, fancy title, but here's what it boils down to. Applied behavior analysis is really looking at the science of behavior. And I will tell you, after doing this for 20 years, behavior is both an art and it's a science. You have to understand the science to know how to apply the art form. So ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis, really looks at the science of understanding and improving student behavior. And it focuses on observable, measurable actions. For example, if you say, man, my class is just so chatty, they interrupt me nonstop. All day, they just interrupt me. Applied behavior analysis would say, define all day, define all the time. Are we talking 3 times a day, 30 times a day, 48 times a day? And so applied behavior analysis moves away from the emotion into the science. And it asks the question, why is it happening? What function is it providing? How do we change it? And then how do we track that change so we have measurable data to know if it's working? The most common model that you're going to see coming out of applied behavior analysis or the science of behavior is the ABC model. And if you get nothing else out of today, this is the one thing I want you to take away, the ABC model. The ABC model looks at 3 things. It looks at the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. The antecedent is that trigger, what happened right before the behavior. The behavior is the easiest thing to see because it's that observable action or that response. It's usually the things we as teachers pick up on first. The consequence is what happened right after the behavior. So often people think about a negative consequence. Consequences can be both positive and negative. A consequence of me going to work is I get paid. That's a positive consequence. So there are positive and negative consequences. So let's just take a real easy one. Let's say it's an involuntary behavior like sneezing. Okay, there's voluntary and involuntary behavior. Some things your body just does, whether you want it to or not. Let's say I drop a big dusty sack of potatoes and dust flies up everywhere. That's the antecedent, the trigger. The behavior is I sneeze because my body says, we don't want that in here, get out. The consequence is all of those contaminants go back out of my body. So that's a really easy antecedent, behavior, consequence. And that was an involuntary one. But we're going to focus on voluntary behaviors, behaviors that we choose. So let's talk about that for a minute. Let's say we have a student in our class and we see the behavior of that student snapping a pencil in anger. That's the behavior that we see. Behavior is almost always the first thing that we see. What I'm going to challenge you to do is anytime you see a behavior that you want to change, ask yourself, instead of jumping straight to the consequence, ask yourself, what caused this? What was the antecedent to that behavior I just saw? What happened just before that behavior of concern? So often as teachers, we want to jump straight to the consequences. I've done that as a teacher. I've done that as a parent. I think we've probably all done it, where we jump straight to the consequence to try and change the behavior. But what I'm here to tell you is, if we don't think about the antecedent, and if we don't address the antecedent, that behavior will come around again and again and again, no matter which consequence you apply. Applied behavior analysis says if you see a behavior of concern, your first instinct should be to think about the antecedent and ask yourself, what triggered that? What caused that behavior? And then ask yourself, is there a consequence that can be applied to reduce the behavior? So let's look at it in a different light. Here's the cycle of applied behavior analysis. If you see the behavior of a student snapping his pencil in anger and staring you right in the eyes, like, what are you going to do about it? I would challenge you, first ask yourself, why? Why did that child just do that? Identify the antecedent that caused the behavior before you think about the consequence. And that's going to cause you to hypothesize, to ask yourself, why did he just do that? And furthermore, what is the functionally equivalent replacement behavior I would rather he do instead of that? We're going to dive into all of these deeply. And then you're going to ask yourself, how do I modify the antecedent and adjust the consequence? So when you see a difficult behavior in your classroom, there's probably something much deeper going on than meets the eye. So let's take this one and break it down. Johnny breaks the pencil and stares at you like, what are you going to do about it? You may do nothing in the immediate. You may choose to just do nothing in the moment and continue teaching. But at some point during that day, you're going to want to ask yourself, why did he do that? What was the antecedent? Was he frustrated? Was there another kid bugging him? Was he trying to get my attention? Was this his way of communicating with me? What was the purpose of the behavior? All chosen behavior, all behavior that we choose has a purpose and it has a function. It is meeting our needs somehow. So if you want this student to choose a different behavior instead of snapping their pencil, you've got to be able to ask yourself, what do I want them to do instead? Well, if the function of the behavior was to get your attention and snapping that pencil got your attention, they're going to do it again because it worked. So you've got to ask yourself, what do I want them to do instead next time they want my attention? Do I want them to raise their hand? Do I want them to verbally call me? Do I want them to raise their paper up in the air and get my attention? If you don't offer them a replacement behavior, they're going to do what's always worked for them. If snapping the pencil gets the attention, they have no reason not to snap that pencil to get your attention in the future. Because the consequence is they got your attention. So if you come back to this most simple form, if the behavior of snapping the pencil, if the purpose is to get your attention, and the consequence is they do get your attention, they're going to keep doing that in the future. So you've got to ask yourself, if I don't want them snapping a pencil to get my attention, what am I going to teach them to do to get my attention a different way? And that's where that Arbinger principle comes in. What am I going to do differently for this student to teach them a different behavior to use to get the same thing? So I'm going to pause there for just a moment and see what kind of comments or thoughts some of my colleagues might have. Ray, Jacob, Mike,
Yep.
any thoughts there?
Well, and actually, I can give you a prime example of that. I had a student my second year that had some psychological issues, and we knew about it, but her nickname was the Screamer. She would scream in class, and it had pretty well been the antecedent was that the students knew she would scream, so they would bug her, they would poke at her, they would say things, whatever. And I knew that, and I worked in teaching chemistry, and so I couldn't afford to have some kids get startled and so on. So I took her aside very calmly and said, "Okay, here's the deal. We do a lot of labs in here, and if you scream in class, then and scare somebody, they could get hurt, or you could get hurt because of the chemicals. I know that they're bugging you, and that's why you scream. And so let's do this. Let's figure out a signal you can give me when feel like you're getting upset. You can step outside the room for a minute till you get calmed back down, and then you come right back in. That's all. That's all you have to do." And she goes, "Okay." And she did not scream in my class one time the entire year. She did scream in other classes, but she didn't scream in mine.
That's a good example. Good example. So let's take this and work it through a different, same behavior. The kid snaps his pencil. Same behavior. But now you're asking yourself, what is the antecedent? If the antecedent or the trigger was he wanted to get out of having to do the work, and he's used to being able to snap his pencil, and suddenly he doesn't have anything to write with, and you're like, you know what? Just don't worry about it. We're not even going to ask you to do that. Then the consequence was he just got out of doing his work. So the antecedent is doesn't want to do the work. Behavior is snaps his pencil. Consequence is doesn't have to do the work. That means next time he doesn't want to have to do the work, he is almost guaranteed to do the same thing again. He's going to snap that pencil because last time it got him out of doing the work. Antecedent, behavior, consequence. If you say to yourself, I would rather give him a different way. I think he snaps his pencil when he gets overwhelmed and he needs a break. And he just needs a 5-minute break. And I want to teach him to just ask for a break instead. The functionally equivalent replacement behavior is simply asking for a break instead of snapping the pencil. So next time when you get that same antecedent he wants out of his work, if you can teach him a replacement behavior such as raise a red index card or a yellow index card, which signals to you, I need a 5-minute break. I'm super frustrated and I don't want to do this work anymore. Then you're trying to replace that behavior with something more appropriate. So the antecedent is he's angry, frustrated with his work, and he doesn't want to do it anymore. Teach him the replacement behavior of holding up a red card, to which you go over and say, hey, let's take a 5-minute break. I can see you're frustrated. I know you're irritated. I'm going to set a timer for you. We're going to take 5 minutes. And when that timer's done, we're going to come back and try again. The consequence now is the same. He got out of doing his work temporarily without having to break his pencil. That's applied behavior analysis, thinking about the science of behavior. Why do we do what we do? And how do we change what we do over time? And at the heart of applied behavior analysis and classroom management is the science of asking the question, why do we do what we do? And how do we replace that behavior with something more appropriate? So you see the behavior, you identify what the antecedent and the consequence was before and after that behavior, And you're asking yourself, why is this student choosing to do this? And what would I rather they do instead? And then it becomes your job to try and modify the antecedent and modify the environment, adjust the consequence, and then track that behavior over time to see if it has in fact changed. We're going to go back just a couple of slides to this one. Antecedent, behavior, consequence. There's one more factor to think about in this, and that's the environment. We've all been in classrooms that were noisy. We've all been in classrooms that were quiet. We've all been in schools that were really busy. We've all been in schools that were opposite. The environment makes a difference when we think about behavior. There are some people who work really well in a noisy classroom. They love it. They thrive in it. They thrive in that interpersonal connection, talking with others, having things going on around them. Some students do not thrive in that environment. They need a quiet work area. And so when we think about the antecedent and we think about triggers, environment is a big part of that. If you're asking yourself, how do I change my whole classroom? That's an environment question. And so if you have a student who basically gets overwhelmed with a lot of noise or a lot of activity and can blow up and then maybe start throwing pencils or yelling, as Mike was talking about, that's an environmental issue. And you've got to ask yourself, can I change the environment for this student or help them escape that environment temporarily to prevent that from behavior from happening in the future? Environment is a big, big part of it. And we as the educator are the number one factor in the environment for our classroom.
And Ryan, if I could, just add to what you just said, I was in a classroom once in United Emirates, and it was a school where instead of the teachers moving instead of the students moving from classroom to classroom at the end of a period, the teachers moved. So the same students would sit in the classroom and the new teacher would come in. And to talk about environment, I was in there for the first or the end of a lesson with one particular teacher. The students were attentive, they were listening, they were very much involved with what was going on. Their behavior was excellent. So this is environment. Then the bell rang. The teacher changed. A new teacher came in, and immediately these students became disruptive. They weren't paying attention. So the teacher obviously created the environment, and the students knew this. They knew that they could get away with it with one teacher, but couldn't get away with it. So that's an environmental thing that I personally observed, and that's why the environment is created by the teacher.
Couldn't agree more, Ray. And really, in my all of my time teaching and all of the schools I've been, the teacher is the number one factor in student success. We as the educator are the number one factor in student success. And when we take that ownership and we believe that we're the number one factor, we're apt to try and change the environment to be more successful for our students. Okay, let's talk about consequences for a moment, because within that antecedent behavior consequence model, over here in the purple, I have adjust consequences. And when people, a lot of times they hear consequence, they think bad consequence. But not all consequences are bad. Like I said, there are times where consequences are good. I go to work, I work my 40 or 50 or 60 hours, however many hours I work that week, I get paid as a consequence. So there are very positive consequences. I go to school, I get a degree, positive consequence. So not all consequences are negative. But there are three, when you think about applied behavior analysis, there are three consequences, three types to think about. The natural consequence, the logical consequence, and what we call a contractual consequence. Let's talk about why this matters. A natural consequence is if I walk out my front door and it's raining, I'm going to get wet. That was a natural consequence. If I walk out my front door and I stand there, I'm going to get drenched. Nobody had to do that to me. Nobody had to make it happen. It was just natural. It happens without intervention. It's unavoidable. So in a school, a natural consequence could be here in Idaho, where I'm at right now, it's cold. It's like 15 degrees cold this morning. If I have a student that runs out the door to recess without her coat, in about 2 minutes, she's going to be pounding on my classroom door wanting back in because the natural consequence was she's going to get cold. Nobody had to do that to her. It just happened. So some consequences are natural. You don't have to do anything. The second type are logical consequences. It requires some kind of intentional design. So it could be you might have a rule in your classroom. If you forget your coat and have to come back in, I'm going to ask you to sit for a minute and think about what it would take for you to remember that before you go out next time. So that could be losing a little bit of recess to come in and retrieve it. That's just a logical thing. The third one is contractual. Contractual consequences don't make a whole lot of sense, except for we just decided that's the way it was. One of the best examples I have for a contractual consequence is a speeding ticket. I don't know how it is in your part of the world, but here in Idaho, if I go way over the speed limit in my car, a police officer is likely to pull me over and give me a speeding ticket. Now, that's not natural because it's a contract. It's a written contract or a verbal contract that if I break the law and I endanger others, a police officer is going to pull me over, write me a ticket on a piece of paper, and then I'm going to have to go down and pay a fine. There's nothing natural about that. That is purely contractual. So in the classroom, that might be something like if you turn your homework in late, you automatically lose 10% of your grade. That's not a natural consequence. That's barely even a logical consequence. That's a contractual consequence. And so when you're thinking about coming back here and adjusting those consequences, you're asking yourself, is this going to be a natural consequence, a logical, or most of them are going to be a contractual consequence? It's something that you're going to fabricate and create. So those are the three kinds of consequences to be thinking about within an applied behavior model. The natural consequences are the easiest. The contractual ones are ones where the student really has to understand, if you do this, this is going to happen. So often we hear the term, well, it's just common sense. No, it isn't. If common sense were common, we would all know it. Common sense is not common because if that student doesn't know and believe and understand ahead of time, then it's not a contractual consequence. There has to be an understanding and an agreement that if I see this behavior, this will be the consequence. That's the contractual consequence. So when you're thinking about trying to change behavior in your classroom or in your school, I encourage you to put most of your effort into those red boxes. When you see a behavior that you want to change, you should immediately ask yourself, man, I wonder why they did that. What caused that? What was the antecedent? Did the kid next to him poke him? Were they frustrated? Were they trying to get my attention? Is this way of expressing themselves because they can't do it verbally, so they're going to do it physically? Your very first thought should be, why did they just do that? And then ask yourself, can I modify something in the future to make them less likely to do that? Can I move them up to the front of the classroom where they can get my attention easier? Do I give them a pencil that they can't break? Do I move them away from that kid that's driving them crazy? Can I put them in an area of my classroom that's less noisy? Should I check in on them more frequently so that they don't have even an option to get frustrated because I'm checking in on them so frustrated? All of those questions get you thinking about, what can I do differently to help that student change his behavior? And then the second thing that I encourage you to really think about is that other red box. Adjust the consequences. If you know that he's snapping that pencil to get your attention, don't give him the attention in the moment. He snaps it, you look at him, you just keep right on walking. Now, the problem with that is now he might choose something different to still get your attention. If snapping the pencil didn't get it, next step could be throwing the paper. It could be yelling. If his goal is to get your attention, he's going to do whatever it takes to get your attention. So you're asking yourself, instead of snapping the pencil, how could he get my attention? Could I give him something to raise up and hold up to signal that he needs my attention? Do I give him permission to call out to me instead? And so adjust those consequences, because the consequence, now hear this part, the consequence is what makes it more likely or less likely you're going to see that behavior again in the future. Why does a police officer give me a ticket and make me pay a fine? It's going to make me less likely to speed in the future because I don't like that fine. So consequences adjust the likelihood of that behavior occurring again in the future. I'm going to pause there for a moment. Ray, Mike, Jacob, anything you want to add to that before we keep going?
I really like the emphasis on antecedent behavior. So many times we don't ask ourselves why did the student do that? Or maybe why did we do it? What caused me to react in a certain way? And I really like the emphasis on what caused that. We can usually do a much better job of fixing it, if you want to call fixing, if we understand why it happened.
Absolutely. And I can tell you as a parent, when I get emotional, I jump right to the consequence. I think we all do sometimes. We see our kids doing something they're not supposed to, and I look at them and I say, I've told you 100 times not to do that. That's it. You're grounded. And I jump right to the consequence. And I would be crazy to think that I didn't do that as a teacher too. There were times I got emotional and I jumped straight to the consequence without asking the question, why? Why are they doing that? And is there something I could be doing to change their behavior so they don't do that? So we know that our emotional tendency is to jump straight to the consequence, but I'm here to tell you the most effective classroom managers always start with the antecedent and the trigger and then adjust consequences after that.
Well, Ryan, I like the idea because I know as an administrator working especially with elementary kids, sometimes the why is they just didn't have enough to eat for breakfast, or they're hungry, or they're tired, and some
Yes.
simple things could happen. And then you start feeling really crappy as an administrator or a teacher, and you're like, oh, I should have recognized that. Or a high school student comes and says, yeah, I really had a rough time at home. My parents are fighting, or whatever happens. And then you can actually, I think that's where it goes back to that relationship building, which is so key to any dealing with classroom management. Is the relationship is key to all of this, the foundation of this ABC model, which I love the ABC model. This is great, very informative.
Jacob, you raised such a great point that when we pause and we take a moment and we ask that student, help me understand why you did that. That's a relationship building question. When we jump straight to the consequence, that's not relationship building, that's authoritarian. When we pause and we legitimately ask the question, why did you choose that? Why did you make that decision? That's a relationship building question. And to Jacob's point, as a principal, there was a time when I had a girl in high school. She made a decision in class. She got booted out of class. She came down to my office and the principal's office. And my first question was, help me understand why did you make that choice? And she broke down crying and said, my mom didn't come home last night and we don't know where she is. And that was an immediate, oh my goodness, the antecedent is so different than what I thought it was. I thought she was just being a pill in class again. I thought that she was doing this because she didn't like the teacher again. And so that antecedent was completely different than my assumptions. And when she said that, I thought, I may be doing the same thing if I were you. And so we treated the consequence differently that day based on what we realized the antecedent was that day. And so don't ever assume that you know what the antecedent is. Truly, if you have the ability, dig in, ask the questions, and really understand where is this behavior coming from. Thanks for that, Jacob. That was a great reminder.
Absolutely. Yeah. When you told your story, it made me think of many times I had students in my office, and And it was probably some of the best relationship building I ever had when you sit down with a person and you start digging about what the problem is, and they just completely break down and say, my life is in shambles. My family's having this problem, this problem, this problem, and I don't want to end up with some of these same problems. Some of the best relationships I've had with students.
Yep.
Yeah, and laying all cards on the table, it makes me think back to my early teaching days. And I think, oh,
Mm.
why did I do that? Why did I react in that way? So I think that's human nature. Sometimes we don't understand this whole idea of what caused the behavior, but we want to think about what can I do about that behavior without thinking. So as I said, laying all cards on the table, I think, oops, I can think of some mistakes I made.
Yep. Absolutely. We've all been there as parents, as educators. I think both probably.
Yeah.
So if you have a student that is repeatedly using negative behavior and you're saying, man, this is keeping our class from learning. It's driving me crazy. It's driving the kids next to them nuts. If you have a student that is a chronic misbehavior, you might consider a functional behavior assessment. An FBA, a functional behavior assessment, is a systematic way to ask the question, why is the student using these behaviors? What is the function? What are they getting out of these behavior? And it's a data collection process, and it usually happens over the course of 2 or 3 days, over 7 or 8 observations, where you're taking some data and you're making some hypotheses about why. What are they getting out of this? What are they getting from it? Why are they using this behavior? And a functional behavior assessment is a really deep dive into a particular individual to ask the question, why are they doing this? And once you develop some hypothesis around why they're doing it, you can develop the behavior improvement plan, the BIP. What a BIP is, it's a tailored intervention to proactively decrease negative behavior. So you're asking yourself, if I don't want them doing this thing over here, what do I want them doing instead? And so it is tailored for an individual. So it is very much designed to teach those functionally equivalent replacement behaviors. If I don't want them to do this thing, what am I going to teach them to do instead? And I'm here to tell you it won't change overnight. It takes days, weeks, and sometimes even months, because the behavior that they're using has worked for them for a long time. If you're a 3rd grade teacher and you have a bunch of 8-year-olds, that means that behavior has been serving them well for 7 or 8 years. Good luck trying to change it in a week. It's going to take you weeks to change that pattern. If you're working with a 16-year-old, that means that behavior has worked for them for a long time. It's going to take you some time to shift that behavior. Please don't expect it to work overnight. It's a process. When you think about FBAs and BIPs, it takes a team. It really does, or at least a colleague to bounce ideas off of. And so if you are working with a student that requires that level of intervention, I'm here to tell you that AI is your friend. If you have access to any kind of AI, it can really help you understand what's going on. So for example, like ChatGPT or Microsoft's Copilot or OpenAI, number 1 rule, don't use the student's name. Because if you use the student's name, you will break confidentiality. So just use a fake name, Susie, Tom, Shakir, whatever name you want. Don't put real names into AI because it's not confidential. But you might ask yourself, if you go into AI, I made this FBA in about 60 seconds last night. What used to take me 3 hours or 2 hours to put together a good functional behavior assessment, I did last night in 60 seconds on ChatGPT. And so as an educator, AI can really be an ally for you in understanding student behavior. I went into ChatGPT, is what I use here in the States, and I said, here's the behavior that I'm seeing. How would I track this behavior? Give me a made up FBA for a fictitious student named Alex Taylor in 5th grade. And this is what it put out. And in 60 seconds, it gave me some potential intervention strategies to use, some next steps to consider, some behaviors to target. And then I told ChatGPT, given what you know about this student, help me develop a functional behavior plan that I could try. And in 30 seconds, it created a very decent behavior intervention plan, and where it says, here's your goals. Your goal is to reduce this behavior and replace it with this behavior. Here's the intervention strategies you can try. Here's some of the data you want to track. And so truly something that used to take me 2 or 3 hours as an educator took me less than 3 minutes last night with the assistance of artificial intelligence like a ChatGPT. The key in using a good artificial intelligence or ChatGPT, one, like I said, never use the student's real name because you don't want to put confidential information in there. But two, get real specific. Here's what I'm seeing. I want to replace it with this behavior. Give me some ideas on how to do that. And I gave you 2 key things to use. Tell it you want it to use applied behavior analysis and the ABC model. If you tell ChatGPT, help me change my students' behavior based on this model, and here's what I want to see, it will spit out 5 or 6 great ideas within 2 minutes. And it will give you a very realistic list of things that you can start working on and trying. But do recognize that it is a team effort. It will take you, maybe your administrator, and a colleague to bounce ideas off of as you think about how to help that student. So with that, I know that we covered a lot, but I will say, if you take nothing away from today, take this piece right here. When you see a student using a behavior, your first instinct should be to ask, why are they doing it? What caused it? What can I do differently? And are there consequences that I can shift and change to decrease the likelihood of that behavior in the future? If you can remember just those 4 things, you will dramatically change your mindset and the way you think about student behavior moving forward.
Well, Dr. Ray, I think we're ready for your words of wisdom, and then we can open it up to questions as people are filling out the survey that we'll be posting directly after your words of wisdom.
Well, I have to tell you, Ryan, I'm in awe of your presentation. I just think this is so important for teachers to understand. I hope that teachers who are at this workshop not only review this regularly, but they share it with the other teachers in their schools and the administrators who are here. This is a wonderful, wonderful way to create some staff development, which would be most helpful. I want to conclude with a statement that I read recently by a man by the name of Larry Ferlazzo, and I'm going to put this in the chat box so that you can all see it. Larry Ferlazzo has an institute on this whole idea of improving educational environment for students and so forth. But he said this, and I think it's very important for people to understand this because it was his statement. He said in classrooms where teachers used a series of techniques centered around establishing, maintaining, and restoring relationships, academic engagement increased by 33% and disruptive behavior decreased by 75%. Think about that. Using the kinds of techniques which Ryan has, Larry Ferlazzo, who is the author of this material, said that academic engagement increased by 33% and student disruptive behavior decreased by 75%. That's an amazing statistics, which I share with you.
Dr. Ray, those were some great words of wisdom. We just always appreciate your thoughts that you put into this. I posted the workshop survey in the chat, so please make sure that you get in, fill that out. And then also where it asks you to fill out 3 things that you learned, please make sure that you actually post something in there. That's the only way that we can verify that you were participating and engaging in this, which I don't think it was very difficult to engage in this workshop. This was outstanding. Dr. Ryan, this was, I think, one of the best workshops we have seen that people can take this information and bring it right into their classroom. First thing Sunday morning for some people in some countries that their first day of the week is Sunday. And for some of those countries where Monday is their first day of the week. We hope that you will take this tool and put it right into your classroom, put it into works with those relationships, figuring out the why, and then coming up with a good plan on dealing with these. So with that, we will take questions. I know there's some people that wanted to raise their hand. You can raise your hand now, or you can put the question in the chat. We'll do questions for about 10 minutes. We did have some questions a little bit further up. Abdullah asked, how can I participate in any upcoming workshops? So Abdullah, every third Saturday, we have a workshop. You can follow us on our Facebook page. We have your emails, so you'll be getting our newsletters. So make sure that you are checking your spam if they may be going to spam. But you can email us to at any time. You're already registered now. It's the same Zoom link actually every single month.
Ryan, I want to ask a question that came up early on in your workshop from one of our participants. How do you make this work in large classes where there are just many, many students, and you need, is there some technique that you can suggest for this happening with a large number of students in a class?
Absolutely. That is usually one of the very first questions I get in these kinds of workshops. And the answer is you focus on the environment. If the behavior that you want to change is my students tend to talk over me as I'm lecturing, that's a very common one. As I'm presenting, students are talking to each other, they're on their phones, they're not paying attention. How do I change that? The answer is it's your classroom environment. And so if you go back to that original principle that most behavior change for your classroom is going to start with you as the educator. The question is, how can you shift and change your environment to increase that classroom participation and decrease that side talk, that side chatter with each other? And so really the question always comes back to what is my environment and how do I proactively set that environment? Answers could be things like, I'm going to walk up and down the aisles. I'm going to use proximity in my teaching, and I'm going to walk between the students as I talk. I'm making constant eye contact with them. I'm increasing my questions. I'm asking questions every 60 to 90 seconds. And by increasing the proximity, how physically close I am to the student, by increasing the number of questions I'm asking and directly making eye contact with those students, those are the kinds of things where you immediately decrease their ability to talk with one another because they're engaged on you. And so when it comes to behavior management and behavior change on a large scale, it always comes down to proactive environment changes. What can I, as the teacher, do proactively before the behavior even occurs?
Thank you.
Yeah, there's some good questions about that. Someone said they had 60 students in their class, and those are the same, and I think that's the same answer. What about Hushnia asked about, does this work with ages 3 and 4?
The answer is yes. The concept of applied behavior analysis can work all the way down into age 3. It's a little bit different. You use more of some discrete trial, they call it, but the answer is yes. Applied behavior analysis can work on any behavior that is voluntary. So any behavior that a person is choosing to engage in, applied behavior analysis works.
That's great. And then Anna Kuznetsova, who's always at our workshops, great question. She has, would you recommend some specific techniques for high school students? Which I commiserate with Anna because I taught high school, and high school kids are just different sometimes.
My answer for high school students, what I have found to be most effective as a high school teacher and a high school principal is I have to build that relationship with them outside the classroom. If I have a high school student who is repeatedly interrupting or repeatedly coming late, the chances of me changing their behavior only during that time in the classroom is very, very small. I usually have to talk with them and build relationship outside of the classroom. I'm going to go to their basketball games. I'm going to go to their soccer games. I'm going to catch them in the hallway. I'm going to know their parents' names. I'm going to know their siblings' names. Building those relationships outside of the classroom and then having those conversations outside of the classroom are usually what changes the behavior inside the classroom from my experience. And this works with small high schools of 100 and large high schools of 3,000.
Yeah, I totally agree. You got to go to their basketball games, you got to go to their plays, go to their different activities, their concerts, all those different things. Anna also has a follow-up question about environment differentiation. Students who love a quiet atmosphere and students, especially high school students, who like to prefer a little bit more active or loud classroom. Any thoughts on that?
There are two ways that I've seen it work. And one is essentially when it comes time to do the work, some teachers will actually break those two students apart to do two different areas in the room. Sometimes the classroom is just too small for that. And so I've actually seen teachers where when it comes to work time, they allow students who prefer that loud interaction to work with one another, and other students are allowed to put ear pods in or headphones or even just earplugs in to try and change that environment and decrease the auditory stimulation in the classroom.
That's great. And then we have two different questions from different people. Nada on Facebook and then Irina have questions about students with special needs. How does this work with students with special needs or students with learning difficulties?
Actually, it was originally designed to work primarily with students with special needs. And so as a special educator, that's where I got introduced to applied behavior analysis, because that most of my career was spent with students in special education. And because you're working with the individual, that's where the ABC model works best, is when you're working with that one student. So if you have students who are maybe on the autism spectrum, or students who struggle with attention, or any number of other students receiving special education services, the ABC model is where it really shines, is with students with special needs, because it individualizes the approach based on their strengths and based on their own individual needs.
That's great. And this one's kind of along the same lines. This is from Nada on Facebook. She says, what should we do if we have ADHD kids or kids who are slow?
Yeah. Yeah. Students that struggle with ADD and ADHD, this works particularly well because you're asking the question, why are they doing what they're doing? And honestly, sometimes the answer is because they can't help it. I mean, honestly, there are times where students with attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, they're engaging in behavior because it's compulsive. They're not choosing to, they're doing it because their brain is telling them to. And so that's when it becomes even more important to ask yourself, why are they doing it? So that you don't assign the wrong consequence. You don't want to punish a student for something that they can't help. That would be like punishing a student for sneezing in class. It doesn't make a lick of sense. And so you have to really be careful about, how do I use consequences in the right way? And how do I really address behaviors that are under their control and that they can choose, versus what do I need to do differently in the environment because they really can't choose the behavior.
Oh, that's great. This one is from Salma on Zoom, and this is a common issue I think that we're dealing with, because a lot of these students speak many different languages. Do you have any thoughts or ideas of how we can best deal with non-native speakers and maybe have that language barrier?
Yes, absolutely. I see this not just with students where there might be a language barrier, but students on the autism spectrum who may be nonverbal or don't read well. And so there are a lot of times where I have used symbols or pictures or different colors of cards on their desk to represent the same thing. So yellow might mean I need a break. Green might mean I need your attention. And so you can color code things. You can use pictorial representation. That requires the teacher to be honed in on that student and paying attention. But I've worked with a lot of nonverbal students on the autism spectrum, and that specifically is what works well in those situations. That can also work for students where there's a language barrier.
Yeah, I love that. Another good question is from Shima and Fasia on Zoom, and this has to do with students who are really aggressive or just shut down. What are some best ways to deal with students who can just be really aggressive, breaking other students' pencils, getting in fights, or if you question them, they don't even want to talk. They're just completely shut down. You can't even figure out the why.
Absolutely. That's such an important question. With students who use aggressive behavior, the antecedent becomes incredibly important to ask yourself, what's triggering this? And can I find that trigger? And to your point, you might have to wait an hour or two or a day or two to talk with the student about it because in the moment, it's only going to make it worse. So you have to time that and be careful. But you're asking yourself, is there something in the environment? Is it a noisy environment? Is it being around another student? Is it this teacher that tends to set them off because they have a poor relationship? Those are all environmental. Or is there a particular antecedent, like when I ask them to do something, or I correct them, or I make them do the problem over? If that's the trigger, then you got to ask yourself, do I want to keep doing that, knowing it leads to this behavior? And so the environment and the antecedent become really important to think about when you're working with a student who can get aggressive.
Yeah, makes sense. I like that answer. And then Shaima asks a question: what happens when a student is just bored and they want to take a break and they just don't really want to engage? They're probably pretty bright and they just don't want to really engage in the classroom.
That's a great question because the antecedent is boredom. Boredom is a
Hmm.
legitimate antecedent. A lot of the negative student behaviors that I see working with students who are gifted and talented, the antecedent is just boredom. And so the question is, what can I give them or what can I engage them in that actually stimulate and interest them? And it usually takes sitting down and asking them that question. Hey, student, I can see that this is boring you and that you're not interested. What can I do to get you engaged in this? Is it a different assignment that meets the same goals? Is it a more advanced assignment? Or is it simply that they just don't want to because they don't want to? And so it comes back to that antecedent, trying to really dig in on the why. Why is this happening?
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, well, I know there's a lot of good comments and thoughts, a lot of people showing appreciation on both Zoom and on Facebook. And so I think Dr. Ray, those are all the
Yeah,
questions that we
I want Ryan to know, I don't know if you had a chance to follow the chat room. We've had several comments, Ryan, saying this is one of the best workshops we've ever done.
Mm.
So thank you for this wonderful, wonderful presentation. Um, I I just feel we all really need to think about the environment that we create or that is created for us in every classroom. And we need to look at that environment. Uh, we can see an awful lot. And I love the idea of, in some cases where the student is really difficult, we need to, in a kind way, pull that student aside and say, hey, what's going on? What do I need to know? How can I make this more relative to where you are? Be surprised how students will open up if they give a chance, if they're given a chance. So thank you, Ryan. This has been a wonderful workshop. And several of you asked, and I know Dr. Jake has answered, this is recorded. You can open this workshop. I hope some of you do, and they show it to your whole teaching staff.
It's on our YouTube page, which you can access right on our website. If there's anything that we can do to help or support you in any way, or if you want your school accredited through us, please reach out to us. And thank you again, Ryan. Really appreciate that. Thank you, Dr. Ray and Dr. Mike.
So have a good evening or day or whatever time it is for you. Just to let you know, we're in the middle of a blizzard here in Denver, Colorado. So we have a lot of snow on the ground. The weather, most of you don't deal with blizzards. We do here. But anyway, enjoy the warm weather. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.